Got it. Here's the first part. Hook shocking start 800 words, exactly as per your outline. The streets of downtown Atlanta were eerily quiet, the dim glow of streetlights barely illuminating the deserted sidewalks. Officer Jake Reynolds gripped the steering wheel of his patrol car with one hand, the other tapping impatiently against the door. It was the last hour of his shift, and he was itching to get home. Then he saw him. A lone black man walking along the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, head slightly lowered. Jake's instincts kicked in. Years of policing had conditioned him to see a certain type of person as a problem. He slowed the car, rolling to a stop just a few feet away from the man. "Hey, hold it right there," Jake barked, pushing open his door. The man stopped but didn't raise his hands. His face remained calm, unreadable. That pissed Jake off. He had dealt with enough cocky punks who thought they could outsmart him. "I said hands where I can see them." Slowly the man raised his hands, but there was no fear in his eyes. Jake stepped closer, flashlight in hand, shining it straight into his face. "Where are you headed this late, huh?" "Home," the man said, his voice steady. Jake scoffed. "Yeah? You live around here?" The man gave a slow nod. "I do." Something about his tone made Jake's jaw clench. It was too sure, too steady. Most people stammered, made excuses, avoided eye contact. But this guy? He stood like he had nothing to prove. Jake's grip tightened around his flashlight. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for. What's your name?" The man didn't flinch. "I'm sure you already ran my plates when you slowed down. You tell me." Jake's lips curled into a smirk. Smart ass. "Let me see some ID," Jake ordered. The man reached into his jacket pocket. Jake's hand flew to his gun holster. "Slowly." The man paused, exhaling sharply, then moved even slower. He pulled out his wallet and handed over his ID. Jake barely glanced at it before tossing it back. "Figures. You people never learn," Jake muttered under his breath, loud enough to be heard. For the first time, the man's expression shifted. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. But he didn't say a word. And that irritated Jake more than anything. "You deaf or something? You don't have anything to say?" Silence. Jake stepped closer, his chest inches from the man's. "You think you're better than me? That it?" The man's face remained blank, unreadable. Jake could feel the anger rising in his chest, his authority slipping through his fingers. He was about to press further, maybe shove the guy a little, remind him who was in charge, when his radio crackled to life. "Unit 22, report back to the station immediately. All officers required on site. Captain's orders." Jake stiffened. The hell was this about? He clicked his radio. "Copy that." His eyes snapped back to the man. His gut told him to stay, to keep pressing, to teach this guy a lesson. But something about the way the man stood there, so unaffected, made his skin crawl. With one last glare, Jake turned and stomped back to his cruiser. The man didn't move, didn't turn away, didn't even blink. As Jake pulled off, something about the encounter sat wrong with him. But he wouldn't understand why, not yet. Not until he got back to the precinct and saw who was waiting for him. Jake Reynolds had been a cop for 13 years, and in that time he had learned one undeniable truth: power belongs to those willing to take it. He had started as a rookie full of ambition, but the streets of Atlanta had hardened him fast. The precinct he worked in had its own set of unspoken rules, shaped by generations of men like him. It was a brotherhood, one that didn't take kindly to change, to softness, to people who questioned the way things had always been. Here, policing wasn't about serving and protecting. It was about control. And that meant keeping people like them in check. The locker room chatter was always the same. They're all criminals anyway. They hate cops, so why should we care? The older officers, the ones Jake had looked up to, had drilled those beliefs into his head. If a black suspect ran, he was guilty. If he didn't, he was hiding something. If he spoke up, he had an attitude. If he stayed silent, he was being defiant. Jake hadn't just accepted these rules, he had thrived under them. But now things were changing. The department had been under federal investigation for months, accused of excessive force, racial profiling, and corruption. Several officers had already been suspended, and the media had latched onto the story like vultures. Now a new captain was taking over in the morning. The entire department had been buzzing about it all week. Rumors spread like wildfire. He's tough, he's by the book, he doesn't take sides. But one rumor had pissed Jake off more than anything. The new captain is one of them. Jake sat at his desk that night, his mind drifting back to the encounters that had shaped him. There was the first time he broke a kid's nose during an arrest. A black teenager had been mouthing off, refusing to get on the ground fast enough. Jake had taught him a lesson. The kid had cried, but Jake's sergeant had patted him on the back afterward. "They only understand force," he had said. "Good job, Reynolds." Then there was the time he pulled over a black father and his son. The father had been nervous, hands trembling on the steering wheel. Jake had taken his time, dragging out the stop, watching the fear in the man's eyes. He hadn't arrested him, hadn't needed to. That kind of fear, it stuck with a man. And then there was the night he and his partner had left a man bleeding on the sidewalk. A suspected gang member, or so they had claimed. No body cams, no witnesses who would dare speak up. Jake had gone home that night, had a beer, and slept like a baby. Because that's what justice looked like. Jake wasn't alone in his way of thinking. Most of the guys at the precinct had the same mentality, an us versus them worldview. The brass talked about de-escalation and building trust with the community, but out on the streets, that was a joke. Trust didn't keep you alive. Fear did. And now, with all this federal oversight, things were getting too soft. Officers were afraid to do their jobs. Suspensions were happening left and right. Good cops were being punished for doing what needed to be done. And now they were bringing in a new captain. Jake could already picture it. Some corporate, clean-cut, woke puppet who was going to come in, shake things up, and make their lives hell. And if the rumors were true, if he was really one of them, Jake clenched his jaw. Tomorrow he'd find out. Tomorrow everything would change. The precinct was unusually tense that morning. Jake walked in, still shaking off the exhaustion from last night's patrol. He could feel the energy in the room, tight, on edge. Groups of officers huddled together, whispering in hushed tones. Something was off. As he made his way to his locker, he caught snippets of conversation. "He's here? Just walked in 5 minutes ago. Man's got a presence. You can feel it." Jake's brow furrowed. He didn't need to ask who they were talking about. He gritted his teeth. Whatever speech this guy was about to give, Jake had already made up his mind. It was all bullshit, just another political stunt, another outsider who didn't understand what it really meant to be a cop. Jake slammed his locker shut and turned toward the briefing room. If this guy was about to waste his time with some progressive lecture, he at least wanted a good seat to roll his eyes from. Jake stepped inside and froze. Standing at the front of the room, staring directly at him, was the same black man he had insulted last night. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs. No way. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The chatter died. The tension turned thick enough to choke on. Every cop in that room was waiting. Waiting for a reaction. Jake could feel his face going pale, his pulse hammering in his ears. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Whoa! Last night he had stopped this man, treated him like just another suspect, insulted him. And now? Now he was standing there in full uniform, his captain's badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Jake swallowed hard. He could still hear his own voice from last night ringing in his head. You people never learn. And Carter? He was still looking at him, cold, calculated. He remembers. Captain Carter took his time. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of his presence settle in the room. He didn't have to say a word. He already owned the space. Then finally he spoke. This department has been under investigation for excessive force and racial bias. His voice was deep, steady, commanding. I've read the reports. I know the numbers. And let me be clear, things are about to change. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. For too long, this precinct has operated under the assumption that it's untouchable. That ends today. Jake clenched his jaw. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. Carter's eyes scanned the room, meeting each officer's gaze one by one. When they landed on Jake, they didn't move. If you've been doing your job the right way, you have nothing to worry about. Carter's voice was ice. But if you've been cutting corners, if you think that badge gives you the right to terrorize instead of protect, a pause. You will be dealt with. The room was suffocatingly silent. Jake felt the burn of Carter's gaze on him, felt the unspoken message in it. I know who you are. I know what you've done, Dot, and I'm watching. Jake forced himself to breathe, forced his expression to remain neutral. He wouldn't let Carter rattle him. As soon as the meeting ended, he stormed out, heading straight for the break room. Behind him he could hear murmurs, cops who had seen the look on his face, who knew exactly what had just happened. This was bad. He needed to act like this didn't bother him, needed to make it seem insignificant. His partner Martinez caught up to him. Yo, that was crazy. He's the guy from last night? Jake scoffed. Yeah, so? He's just another suit. They all come in talking big. Martinez raised an eyebrow. Man, I don't know. He's different. You saw how he looked at you. Jake shrugged. Let him look. But his voice didn't have the usual confidence, because deep down, Jake knew. This wasn't just another suit. Carter wasn't here to play games. An hour later, Jake got called into Lieutenant Harris's office. Harris was one of the old-school guys, one of the few people in the department Jake actually respected. But when he walked in, the look on Harris's face made his stomach drop. Close the door, Reynolds. Jake did. Harris leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. You got a problem, son. Jake frowned. What kind of problem? Harris hesitated, then slid a folder across the desk. Your name's been flagged. Jake's blood ran cold. Flagged? Internal Affairs is reviewing your record. Carter personally requested a list of every officer with excessive force complaints in the last 5 years. Your name's on it, more than once. Jake's pulse pounded. That doesn't mean anything. Half the guys here have complaints. Harris gave him a hard look. Yeah, but not all of them have Carter looking at them like a damn sniper. Jake felt the walls closing in. He had always thought he was untouchable. Now? Now he wasn't so sure. Jake sat in his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Everything was spiraling. Internal Affairs, investigations. His name flagged. Because of Carter. That smug son of a bitch had barely been here a day, and he was already tearing into him. Jake exhaled sharply, trying to think. He needed allies. He couldn't go down alone. Jake stormed into the locker room, scanning the faces of the officers inside. Some looked at him and quickly looked away. Others whispered under their breath. The message was clear. Fear was spreading. The moment Carter set his sights on him, everyone else started stepping back. Jake spotted Sergeant Bill Cooper by the benches, one of the old-timers, someone who had always had his back. Jake approached, voice low. We need to talk. Cooper glanced around and sighed. Jake, not here. That only pissed him off more. So what, you're scared now too? Cooper gave him a hard look. No, I'm smart. You should be too. IA is sniffing around, and Carter ain't playing. You make the wrong move, you're done. Jake clenched his jaw. You expect me to just roll over? Cooper exhaled, leaning in. I'm telling you as a friend, lay low. Ride this out. Carter's got the department on edge, but no captain lasts forever. Jake's blood boiled. Lay low? Surrender? He had spent years climbing the ranks, earning his reputation. Now, just because some damn politically appointed captain wanted to make an example out of him, he was supposed to roll over like a dog? Hell no. Jake barely made it to his desk before his phone buzzed. Lieutenant Harris. He answered. Yeah? Harris's voice was clipped. IA just pulled your old complaints. Everything from the past 5 years is back on the table. Jake's stomach dropped. You told me those were buried. Harris exhaled. They were. But Carter's got them digging. And this time, it ain't just a routine review. They're looking for something. Jake swallowed. He knew exactly what that meant. They weren't just reviewing him. They were hunting him. Jake needed an edge, a way to flip the script before Carter buried him. And he knew exactly where to start. Detective Roy Sanders. Sanders had been around forever. He knew every skeleton in the closet, every cop's dirty little secrets. And more importantly, he liked to talk. Jake found him in the records office, flipping through files. Hey, Sanders. The detective barely glanced up. Reynolds? Jake leaned against the counter, lowering his voice. Word is, Carter's got a history. You ever hear anything? Sanders hesitated. He was cautious, but Jake knew the man couldn't resist good gossip. After a pause, he sighed. There was a case. Few years back. Carter was involved in a shooting. Internal Affairs got called in. Jake's pulse quickened. He kill someone? Sanders shook his head. No, but it was messy. The guy he shot was unarmed. Claimed he was reaching for a weapon, but there was no gun found. IA cleared him, but the family went after the city. Lawsuit, media pressure, you know how it goes. Jake smirked. You got details? Sanders hesitated, then sighed. Maybe. Jake reached into his pocket and slid a crisp $100 bill across the counter. Sanders glanced at it, then exhaled. Give me a couple of days. Jake grinned. Make it quick. As he walked away, he felt a spark of triumph. Carter wanted to play games? Fine. Jake was about to flip the board. Jake walked into the precinct the next morning ready for war. Today, everything changed. He had dirt on Carter. Just one slip-up was enough to ruin a man's career. But before he could act, the atmosphere in the station felt off. Officers whispered in corners, their eyes flicking toward him before quickly looking away. Even Sergeant Cooper wouldn't meet his gaze. Something was wrong, very wrong. Then he heard it. His name. Murmurs in the hallway. Did you see the footage? Reynolds is done. His stomach turned to stone. What the hell were they talking about? Before Jake could demand answers, a voice boomed through the station intercom. Officer Reynolds, Captain Carter wants you in the briefing room, now. A cold sweat broke across Jake's neck. He forced himself to walk, keeping his shoulders squared. Whatever this was, he wasn't going down without a fight. As he entered, every officer inside turned to him, eyes filled with judgment. Carter stood at the front, a large screen behind him, paused on a grainy video frame. Jake's gut twisted. Bodycam footage, his bodycam footage. Carter's face was unreadable as he pressed play. Jake watched himself on the screen. A nighttime stop. A black man standing beside his car, hands raised. Jake's own voice filled the room. You fit the description. You people always do. Jake's heart pounded. The footage continued, showing him pushing the man against the car, frisking him aggressively. A planted suspicion, a manufactured reason for the arrest. Then another clip, another black man, another excuse, another unnecessary arrest, one after the other. Evidence of racial profiling, evidence of who he really was. Carter let the final clip fade before speaking. Effective immediately, Officer Jake Reynolds is suspended, pending an internal investigation. The room exploded. Gasps, murmurs. Someone even let out a low whistle. Jake's world shattered. "This is bullshit," Jake exploded, stepping forward. "That footage is taken out of context." Carter didn't flinch. "The full clips are worse." Jake felt rage burning under his skin. He turned to his fellow officers, expecting support, expecting outrage. Instead, they looked at him like a man on death row. Even Cooper, even Sanders, all of them knew. None of them would fight for him. His allies were gone. Carter's voice was calm but ice cold. "Turn in your badge and gun, Reynolds." Jake's hands trembled as he removed his badge, his weapon. He slammed them onto the table. Carter didn't even blink. Jake's whole life had just been ripped away. Jake stormed out of the room, barely able to think. His Bodycam footage. Who the hell had leaked it? And why now? Before he could process it, his phone buzzed. A new email. Subject: "You're not the only one." Jake frowned and clicked it open. Then his breath caught. Attached to the email were more files, more footage, more reports, not just about him. Other officers. Worse things. Cover-ups, fabricated charges, beatings. And whoever sent it had sent it to the press, too. Jake's blood ran ice cold. This wasn't just about him anymore. The entire precinct was about to go down. Jake's fists clenched as he stormed down the hall. His career was crumbling. His so-called allies had abandoned him. And Captain Carter, the man who had humiliated him, stood at the center of it all. Jake barged into Carter's office, slamming the door behind him. Carter barely looked up, calm, unshaken. Jake's voice dripped with venom. "You set me up." Carter leaned back in his chair, eyes cold. "You did this to yourself." Jake's face burned. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Carter didn't blink. "No, just cleaning up the mess." Jake scoffed, stepping closer. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. These guys will never let you take them down." Carter finally stood, tall, unbothered. "We'll see about that." Then a knock on the door. Jake turned, his breath caught. FBI agents. Dark suits, stern faces. The cavalry had arrived. The room felt smaller, tighter. The end was here. The precinct was in chaos. The FBI moved in, agents swarming the halls, files being seized, computers confiscated. One by one, officers were pulled aside, some led away in handcuffs. Corruption charges, civil rights violations, conspiracy. Years of unchecked power, collapsing in real time. Sergeant Cooper was the first to crack. His voice shook as he pleaded with an agent. "I was just following orders. It didn't matter." The cuffs clicked shut. More officers resisted, shouting, shoving. "This is a goddamn witch hunt. We did nothing wrong." Jake watched the carnage, heart pounding. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be untouchable. Now he was next. Two agents approached. Officer Jake Reynolds? His jaw tightened. Carter watched from a distance. Waiting, watching. Jake took a slow step back. His mind raced. Fight? Run? Something. But there was nothing left to do. His voice cracked. "I was just doing my job." Carter's stare was cold. "No, you were doing whatever the hell you wanted. That ends today." Jake's breath hitched. He turned to the agents, ready to protest, to fight for his last shred of power. Then Carter stepped forward and reached for Jake's badge. Jake's pulse pounded. His fingers twitched as Carter's hand closed around it. A slow, deliberate pull, ripping away the last thing Jake had left. Carter's voice was like steel. "You're done." Jake felt the floor collapse beneath him. The cuff snapped around his wrists. His badge was gone. And so was everything else. Jake sat in his empty apartment staring at the floor. No badge dot, no gun dot, no power. Just silence. The city moved on without him. The precinct, his precinct, was being dismantled. Investigations, trials, careers burning overnight. He saw it on the news. Mass corruption exposed in the police department, systemic abuse revealed. His name was everywhere. His phone? Dead silent. The same men who once backed him, who laughed at his jokes, who covered for him, gone. He had nothing left, nothing but time. Time to think about where it all went wrong. Jake found himself outside the precinct, watching. Through the window he saw Carter, the man who took everything from him, standing in the office that once belonged to him. Carter turned. Their eyes met. Jake felt the weight of it. That stare, that judgment. Carter didn't need to say a word. Jake already knew. Justice has a long memory. The words echoed in his head. He turned to leave, but then an envelope. Sitting on his car windshield. No name, no sender. Jake hesitated, fingers trembling. He opened it, and his breath caught. Inside, a single photograph. Grainy, black and white, taken from the shadows. It was him. A picture of Jake himself. His hands clenched. Who took this? Why? On the back, a single line of text. "It's not over.